In the summer of 1953, an archaeologist named James Ford sat with a stack of aerial photographs taken years earlier by the Army Corps of Engineers over the survey ground of northeastern Louisiana. Ford worked out of the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and he had already spent time walking a stretch of high ground above Bayou Macon in West Carroll Parish, ground that had been producing workstone since at least 1840, when a prospector named Jacob Walters, searching the area for lead ore, reported finding Native American artifacts scattered across a cotton plantation called Poverty Point. An archaeologist named Samuel Lockett had logged the site formally in 1873. A Harvard-trained collector named Clarence Bloomfield Moore had dug there in 1913, funding the excavation himself out of a family paper fortune. All three men had stood on that ground. None of them had seen what the photograph now showed Ford from above a desk in New York. 6 enormous rings of raised earth, nested one inside the last, curving open toward the water like a hand pressed flat into wet clay and lifted away. What the photograph revealed, and what decades of excavation since have confirmed on the ground itself, is a set of 6 concentric ridges, built from earth carried in baskets, arranged in a shape close to a fingerprint. Each ridge originally stood about 6 feet high. The outermost ring runs nearly 3/4 of a mile across, enclosing a central plaza of more than 40 acres. The ridges are so wide and so gently sloped that a person walking one at ground level feels only a slow, shallow rise and fall underfoot, nothing that registers as construction. From the air, in low morning light, the pattern reads instantly as built. 6 arcs, evenly spaced, opening toward the bayou, raised without the help of a single domesticated animal or a single wheel. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The largest single feature at the site is a mound the excavators came to call Mound A, sometimes the bird mound for the shape it takes when viewed from directly overhead. It rises roughly 70 feet above the surrounding plain and contains, by the most recent engineering estimate, close to 238,000 cubic meters of earth. Every cubic meter of that earth was moved by hand. There is no evidence anywhere at the site of a cart, a sledge, a domesticated ox, or a wheel of any kind. What the excavation record shows instead are thousands of small, discolored patches in the soil, the compacted remains of individual basket loads, each one dumped, tamped, and covered by the next. The mound is not a single event. It is the accumulated residue of an enormous number of individual human trips, up a slope, back down, and up again. None of the people who did this work were farmers. The soil at Poverty Point holds no trace of domesticated maize, no cultivated seed of any kind. What it holds instead is fish bone, deer bone, turtle shell, the hulls of hickory nuts and acorns, and the remains of aquatic plants gathered from the surrounding wetlands. The people who built the ridges and raised the bird mound fed themselves the way hunter-gatherer bands had fed themselves for thousands of years before them, and there is no sign that farming ever entered the picture at any point during the roughly 5 or 6 centuries the site was in continuous use. They also made no pottery, or at least none has been recovered in any quantity. What they made instead, by the thousands, were small fired clay cooking bowls, packed into earth ovens and pits to hold and radiate heat the way a stone might, a workaround for a landscape that offered almost no natural stone at all. And there are no burial mounds. Excavators who have opened comparable earthworks across the southeastern United States routinely find human remains inside them. At Poverty Point, after more than a century of digging, none have been found. The absence itself is now treated by archaeologists as data, not as an oversight waiting to be corrected. What the site does hold, in quantity, is stone that came from nowhere near Louisiana. Excavators have recovered copper worked from ore sources more than 800 miles north around the Great Lakes. They have recovered galena, a lead ore sourced from the upper Mississippi Valley. They have recovered soapstone quarried in the Appalachian foothills of Alabama and Georgia, and flint and chert carried down from the Ozark and Washita uplands and the Ohio and Tennessee river valleys. None of it arrived by cart or by domesticated pack animal. It came down the river system, most likely by canoe, carried and traded hand to hand across a network that had no writing to record its own transactions and left only the finished objects as proof that the exchange happened at all. A society without agriculture, without metal tools of its own manufacture, without a wheel, moved raw stone across a significant portion of the eastern half of a continent, worked it into beads, plummets, and ornaments on site, and then, in many cases, buried the finished pieces in the ridges as the ridges were built, an offering with no surviving explanation attached to it. Moore's excavation in 1913 turned up a portion of this material, the polished stone, the exotic minerals, more than enough to mark the site as significant. What Moore could not do, standing on ground too broad and too subtly shaped to read from a footpath, was see the ridges as a designed whole. His notes describe scattered mounds and worked stone. They do not describe 6 deliberate arcs, because from the ground, with barely 6 feet of relief spread across 3/4 of a mile, 6 deliberate arcs do not present themselves as 6 deliberate arcs. They present as gently undulating pasture. It took an aerial photograph, 4 decades after Moore packed up his tools, to turn an assortment of mounds into an engineered plan. The difficulty in seeing Poverty Point for what it was ran deeper than one man's vantage point on one field. For most of the 19th century, the dominant explanation offered for earthworks like these across the entire Mississippi and Ohio valleys was not that Native American communities had built them, it was that they had not. A theory took hold among American antiquarians and was repeated by presidents that a separate and vanished race, older and more civilized than the tribes European settlers found living on the continent, had raised the mounds before being wiped out or driven off by the ancestors of the very people the government was, in that same period, actively removing from their land. The theory was convenient. It cast the mound-building past as belonging to nobody currently standing on the ground, and it treated native dispossession as merely history repeating an older, unrecorded pattern. It was also false, and by 1894, the Bureau of American Ethnology had said so in plain terms. An ethnologist named Cyrus Thomas, after 2 decades of comparative fieldwork across hundreds of mound sites, published a report for the Bureau concluding that the earthworks were the achievement of the ancestors of the Native American nations who had always lived among them. The vanished race theory did not survive Thomas's report intact, but the assumption it had spread, that large-scale earthen construction was somehow beyond what an indigenous, pre-agricultural society could organize on its own, proved far harder to kill than the theory itself. That assumption is the real reason a set of ridges, spanning 3/4 of a mile, could sit in open pasture in West Carroll Parish for another 60 years after Thomas's report, before anyone thought to ask what an aerial photograph might show. Ford returned to the site with a colleague named Stuart Neitzel, and the excavation that followed, extending across subsequent decades and subsequent research teams, slowly built the picture that stands today. The most recent and in some ways the most startling addition to that picture came in 2013, when a team led by T.R. Kidder, an anthropologist at Washington University in St. Louis, and Anthony Ortman, a geologist then at Murray State University, published an analysis of the internal structure of the bird mound itself. Kidder and Ortman had cored the mound and examined its sediment layer by layer, looking specifically for the fine bands of erosion and redeposited silt that rainfall leaves behind whenever raised earth sits exposed for any length of time. Northeastern Louisiana receives substantial rainfall in an ordinary year. A mound built gradually, over seasons or years, should show that history written into its layers. The bird mound does not show it. The sediment record indicates the entire structure, close to 250,000 cubic meters of earth, went up with no interruption long enough to register a single significant rain event, a construction window the team placed at under 90 days, and possibly closer to 30. To move that much earth in that shorter window, by the most conservative labor estimates, requires a coordinated workforce in the range of 3,000 people working in shifts, which in turn implies a connected population, counting those not hauling earth on any given day, of several thousand more. That is not the profile of small, scattered foraging bands assembling by chance. That is organization on a timeline at a scale that the field's working model of hunter-gatherer society, as recently as the 21st century, did not have room for. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Poverty Point is not the oldest example of this pattern in Louisiana. It is not even close. Roughly 130 miles to the southwest, in the floodplain of the Washita River, near the town of Monroe, there is a cluster of 11 earthen mounds connected by low ridges into a rough oval nearly 900 feet across. The site is called Watson Break for the small stream that runs beside it, and for most of the 20th century, no professional archaeologist had any reason to think it was anything more than a later, smaller relative of Poverty Point. A local resident named Recca Bamberg Jones changed that. After a timbering operation cleared the trees from the land, Jones examined aerial photographs of the cleared ground and noticed the arrangement of the rises, a pattern too regular to be accidental. She brought it to the attention of the archaeological community in the region, and eventually the site came to the attention of Joe Saunders, an archaeologist then with what is now the University of Louisiana at Monroe. Saunders walked the ground the way any archaeologist would, expecting to find the artifacts that mark a Poverty Point era occupation, the imported stone, the cooking balls, the characteristic tool types. He found none of it. What that absence suggested, if the site was genuinely connected to the Poverty Point tradition, did not add up. In 1993, Saunders returned with Thurman Allen, a soil scientist working for the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Monroe, and the two of them drove a soil auger down into the largest of the 11 mounds. About 1 meter below the surface, the core brought up a distinct reddish, clay-enriched band, the kind of soil horizon that only forms over a span of many centuries of undisturbed weathering. That horizon sat beneath the base of the mound, not within it, meaning the ground itself had already been sitting exposed and aging for a long time before anyone began piling earth on top of it. Radiocarbon dates run on charcoal recovered from directly beneath the mound returned an age of roughly 5,400 to 5,300 years before the present. Saunders did not publish quickly. The dates were rerun, cross-checked, and re-examined for years before the findings appeared in the journal Science in 1997, under Saunders's name along with several co-authors, stating plainly that Watson Break was, at that point, the oldest known large-scale mound complex anywhere in North America, roughly 1,900 years older than Poverty Point itself, predating the pyramids of Egypt and the standing stones of Salisbury Plain in England by close to 1,000 years. The 11 mounds at Watson Break range from about 3 feet to about 25 feet in height. There is no evidence of agriculture in the soil or the refuse layers, only the remains of fish, deer, and wild plants, the same subsistence pattern that would still define Poverty Point 19 centuries later. There is no evidence of permanent year-round habitation, and there are no elaborate burials, no concentration of prestige goods with any one individual, nothing that points toward a chief or a ruling lineage directing the labor from above. What the refuse layers do show is construction happening in distinct stages, with time gaps between them long enough for household trash to accumulate on the surface before the next layer of building resumed, consistent with a group that returned to the same ground season after season, generation after generation, and kept adding to it. Set the two sites side by side, and the pattern stops looking like an isolated curiosity. Watson Break goes up around 3,500 years before the Common Era. Poverty Point goes up more than 1,000 years after Watson Break was already abandoned, on a far larger scale, with a far wider trade network, but built by people following the same basic rule: communities without agriculture without metal tools, without wheeled transport, organizing enough coordinated labor to move earth on a scale that, in the case of the bird mound, still challenges what a modern engineering team would consider a reasonable construction schedule. Two sites in the same river system, separated by roughly 1900 years and connected by nothing more than the accident of both surviving into an era with radiocarbon dating and aerial photography, describe the same capability appearing, apparently independently, in the same region more than once. Neither site was expected. Watson Brake overturned assumptions the field had held about Poverty Point being the starting point of the whole tradition. Poverty Point, decades earlier, had already overturned an older assumption entirely, the one that said monumental construction could not happen at all without farming to feed the workforce. Both sites survive today in something close to their original form, because both sit on ground that turned out to be marginal for later agriculture and was therefore never ploughed flat. Poverty Point is now protected as a state historic site and was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Property, one of the small number of places in the United States to carry that designation, specifically because of the earthworks Ford spotted from the air in 1953. Watson Brake remains largely in private hands, its 11 mounds still standing inside second-growth forest southwest of Monroe, visited far less often, protected mostly by its own obscurity and by the difficulty of reaching it. Neither site required a cover-up to remain unknown for as long as it did. Both were simply too large, too spread out, and too gently shaped to be recognized on foot, by people who had no reason to expect that a hunter-gatherer band was even capable of building something worth recognizing in the first place. The evidence was never hidden. It was standing in the open the entire time, at a scale the eye could not process from ground level, and the mind, for a very long while, was not prepared to credit. What neither site can tell us, and what no amount of further excavation is likely to recover, is a name. Archaeologists do not know what language the builders of either site spoke. They do not know what the people of Poverty Point called their home, their mounds, or themselves, and they do not know what to call the community at Watson Brake beyond the name of the modern landowner's stream. The name Poverty Point itself comes from a 19th-century cotton plantation established on the land more than 3,000 years after the ridges were finished, a name with no connection at all to the people who raised the earth beneath it. That gap is not the product of a lost document or a withheld report. It is the product of thousands of years without writing, followed by centuries of disease, displacement, and disrupted lineage across the entire region in the wake of European contact, a rupture thorough enough that no oral tradition has come down attached specifically to either site. The stone is there, the measurements are there, the radiocarbon dates are published, peer-reviewed, and openly available to anyone who wants to check them. The name of a single person who carried a single basket of earth up the side of the bird mound in the space of 90 days, or set the first course of the tallest mound at Watson Brake 54 centuries ago, is not there, and it is very unlikely ever to be. It would be simpler, in a way, if something had been destroyed, if a fire had taken a courthouse full of ledgers and left a gap someone could point to and explain. What actually happened at both sites is quieter than that and harder to argue with. There was never a ledger. There was never a written name to lose. The people who raised Watson Brake left the continent's earliest known monumental construction and walked away from the written record entirely, because writing, in this part of the world, did not exist yet for anyone to leave a mark in. The people of Poverty Point, more than 1,000 years later, still had none. What both sites offer instead of a name is a signature written in soil, in stone carried hundreds of miles, and in a construction schedule precise enough that a geologist working with a soil corer, 5,000 years after the fact, could still read the number of days it took. Go back at the end of it to Ford at his desk in 1953, looking down at a photograph of ground he had already walked without understanding what it held. What the photograph gave him was not new evidence. The evidence had been sitting in that field since before the pyramids existed, since before Stonehenge existed, since more than 5,000 years before a camera was ever pointed at it from an airplane. What the photograph gave him was the one vantage point that let a human eye finally see it. The mounds did not need to be uncovered. They needed to be looked at correctly, and once they were, the whole model of what a society without farming, without metal, and without the wheel was capable of building had to be revised, twice, on the strength of dirt that people just like us had carried, one basket at a time, more than 3,000 years before anyone thought to write any of it down. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.